Hello and welcome to the BYU Family History Library webinar series. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Bryant and I'll be your host for this webinar. Please make sure your microphones and web cameras are disabled during the presentation to provide for a smooth recording. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You are welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments and insights. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar is next week at the same time, Wednesday at 5:30 p.m., Mysteries of the Changelog Revealed with Catherine Grant. If you would like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from Bonnie Belza, who will be giving a presentation on how to ask your DNA question. Bonnie Belza is a family historian and genetic genealogy DNA researcher whose degree in gerontology led her to genealogy research. She has attended I4GG, the International Genetic Genealogy Conference, Roots Tech, SLIG, and many national and local conferences, and is a frequent lecturer. She teaches the DNA kindergarten class at the 500-plus member West Valley Genealogical Society in Arizona and presents on DNA genealogy with a focus on learning how to use DNA fun. And if Bonnie is ready, then we'll turn the time over to her.
Well, thanks, Brian, and thanks to all our participants for listening in today. Our topic today is how to ask your DNA question. What if you had 10 minutes of any of these experts' time? You may be familiar with some of these folks, genetic genealogy and DNA experts with names like Blaine Bettinger, C.C. Moore, Dr. Lewis Gates, bloggers like Roberta Estes, Kitty Cooper, and Leah Larkin, and developers like Johnny Pearl, among others. Imagine that you got on an elevator with them, going up many floors, 10 minutes, 20 minutes of their undivided attention. What DNA question would you ask and how? In today's presentation, we'll consider how to ask a DNA question. I'll begin by providing some background on genealogical queries and identifying the key elements to provide when asking a DNA question. We'll take a look at some examples, both good and bad, and I'll explain how a well-constructed question can result in better responses from your DNA matches and improve collaboration with others to solve DNA problems. We'll also take a look at opportunities for asking a DNA question. First, a little background. Some of you may remember Everton's Genealogical Helper. It was a major genealogical publication that started in 1947, long before message boards and the internet, and it continued for over 50 years. Individuals could submit requests where they were supposed to provide their own name and their full mailing address for getting in contact with them. They also provided the subject's information, such as, "I'm researching John Smith," and included facts about the subject. They were specific as to locations, dates, and other parties that were related to the question. They would also include a statement of their question. Here's an example of one of the entries in Everton's Genealogical Helper. The registrations, as they were called, were listed alphabetically by the surname and then numbered so that they could be referenced in the future. Here we have one from Mrs. George B. Freeman, also known as Janice Robbins, who lived at Route 7, Salem Road, Murfreesboro, Tennessee. She says she needs info on descendants of my great-great-great-great-grandfather, a Revolutionary War veteran. His name's Eleazar Cole, and he lived from 1747 to 1833. She's also interested in information on his wife, Lucy Shirtleff. She indicated that the entire family removed from Mass to Oxford County, Maine, about 1788. She references other entries in the genealogical helper by their reference number to provide further details. She lists their daughters and their spouses. She says that the descendants started leaving Maine by 1830 and could be anywhere now. Pretty detailed entry, don't you think? This format provides a starting point for developing our DNA question. If you're further interested in Everton's genealogical helper, digitized versions of all 200 issues beginning in 1947 are available at myheritage.com. Those of you who have taken classes or studied genealogy methods are probably familiar with the concept of defining your research question. It is one of the first steps in pursuing genealogical research as described by the Board for Certification of Genealogists, whose icon is shown here. Your research question is the basis of your search, and the same approach used for regular genealogy questions applies when doing DNA research for genealogy. To start, you want to be specific and have an objective. Your research question should focus your efforts on a particular question, and the more specific your question, the more likely you are to have success. You'll want to have a succinct statement of the known facts related to your research question. Like Sergeant Friday on Dragnet used to say, just the facts, ma'am. Or, more accurately, all we want are the facts, ma'am. As you progress in your research, you'll develop a hypothesis or a possible answer to your research question, and you'll want to know how you might prove it or disprove it. A hypothesis is based on some initial findings. It's not an assumption that you have when you begin your research. You have to have done a little bit of homework before you can develop a hypothesis. You might have information like the amount of DNA shared with someone, or paper documents such as birth, marriage, or death certificates, census records, and other paper trails that you've discovered. Lastly, you may have been pursuing a research strategy already to address your hypothesis, and you may have a summary of your efforts to date. These are your beginning pieces of the DNA question that you're going to put together. So let's take a question and apply the criteria to come up with a better DNA genealogy question. For example, in stating an objective, I've said, who were the parents of John Yerkes Bossert, who died in Sunbury, Pennsylvania in 1830? You can see it's specific and detailed information about the person that is the focus or the subject of the question. I provided some known facts. John may have been baptized in Montgomery, Pennsylvania in 1801, and the parents listed were John and Maria Bossert. I've developed a working hypothesis. I've said, what do I want to prove using DNA? Well, my father is a direct male line descendant and therefore should share DNA with John Yerkes' brother Bossert's parents. So my research strategy and my efforts to date have been to have a Y-DNA test done of my father, and now I'm exploring how to use those results to identify John Yerkes Bossert's parents. One important thing to note is that while your DNA question is very specific and applies to a specific subject person, often the answers we get to our DNA question are more generic and a guideline to how to proceed. Some common questions about DNA and genealogy are really addressing the need for DNA education and an understanding of DNA technical issues. For example, I've heard questions like, what DNA test should I take? Or, can DNA prove XYZ? I've had people ask, why doesn't my ethnicity show in my DNA results? And lots of questions about, how am I related to my DNA match? These types of questions can often be answered by pursuing reading books on DNA science, listening to webinars and watching YouTube videos, and by searching discussion forums on social media platforms like Facebook. Part of your research strategy with DNA is to become familiar with the terminology of DNA and develop a knowledge base. Just like when you do regular genealogy research and you're looking at a place where your relatives may have lived, you research that area before you proceed to develop your questions. I recommend Blaine Bettinger's book, The Family Tree Guide to DNA Testing and Genetic Genealogy, for those who like to learn by reading about a new topic. Another source is the International Society of Genetic Genealogy, or ISGG. It has a wonderful wiki, which is a collaborative website that can be edited by its members, so it's constantly being kept up to date. The isog.org/wiki is an encyclopedia of information on genetic genealogy, and it includes an extensive glossary of terms. If you enjoy watching videos, the BYU Family History Library has a 4-part basic series I recorded earlier this year called DNA Kindergarten. So now that you've done some homework and you're ready to construct your question, let's consider some steps. The BCG offered a 10-minute methodology for asking a good research question a couple of years ago. It recommends first to slow down. DNA is a complex subject and it can reveal a lot of information. Focus on a particular topic, a particular subject, a particular time. Slow down and identify something that is manageable to seek an answer to. Ask only one question at a time. If you've ever had the opportunity to speak with a lecturer after their lecture or a presenter after a conference, make sure that you ask one question and give other people time to ask their questions. Identify a unique individual, someone that you're focused on again. You may have a group or an event that you're interested in, but in most cases, you want to look at a particular person and provide information about that person's time frame, place, life, relatives, and that will help you build your DNA question about them. Specify what you want to learn. Again, that word about being specific. And work from what you know, those facts that you've gathered, to what you don't know. So now we have the structure for a good research question and a methodology. Let's apply these to several different examples. Here's a DNA question. Were my grandmother Grace and sister Alice from the same parents? How could we make this a better DNA question? Well, let's start off with some specificity. Were my maternal grandmother, Grace, so now we know we're talking about the person's maternal side of their family, and her sister Alice from the same biological parents? You might not think to specify biological parents, but it does narrow down the possible solutions and answers to this question. So then we'll take a look at how we answer and build an objective, known facts, a hypothesis, and strategy. Our objective might be stated as use DNA to identify a relationship between two people, Grace and her sister Alice. The known facts could be birth certificates, census records, wills, marriage records that we have on the girls and their descendants. My hypothesis could be something like, if Grace and sister Alice are full siblings, then their children would be first cousins and their grandchildren would be second cousins. Now I'm coming to living descendants of Grace and Alice. So what would be my strategy? I want to do autosomal DNA testing on the grandchildren, that is, second cousins, of Grace and Alice. Here's another question. Who are my adopted daughter's birth parents? Many people do DNA testing to resolve unknown parentage. Be aware that before even asking a question like this, you should have the permission of the adoptee and have made them aware of the possibility of finding upsetting information. Your objective in this question is to identify the biological parents of a person. And with your adoptee, you may not want to use their actual name or refer to them only by their first name for privacy reasons. You'll want to have gathered known facts such as where the person was born, calculate when they were probably conceived, their age, where they have done any DNA testing, that is, which companies their DNA has been transferred to, their ethnicity results, and the DNA matches that have been discovered. In developing a hypothesis, we don't want to practice confirmation bias. Just because you have a birth certificate or non-identifying information from the adoption records that identify a parent or the name of a parent, that doesn't mean that information is accurate or true, and you don't want to pursue a path without actual evidence of valid information. In this case, I would suggest a strategy of having further education on solving adoption using DNA. There's a lot of factors that go into identifying that information. A good place to start would be with the Facebook group by DNA Adoption, an organization that provides assistance to people looking to identify their birth parents. Here's another question. Who is my maternal great-aunt's grandchild's father? Oops. I've seen questions like this, or even worse, one that includes not only the family names, but a long, drawn-out story about how your great-aunt, the one who made that wonderful recipe that you would always have for Thanksgiving, you've heard those kinds of questions. You wish the person would just get to the point. The point is, you need to be clear and you need to simplify things. Again, you may only have 10 minutes in that elevator. So another way of wording this question is to say, who is the biological father of my second cousin, Sally? Our objective here then is to identify the Sue. Identify the biological father of my second cousin, Sue, who was born in September 1944 in Charlotte, North Carolina. The known facts I have is that she was probably conceived in December of 1943. She's 77 years old, of Irish and English ethnicity, and she has results from testing at Ancestry and 23andMe. and her closest DNA match is a 55-year-old male sharing 1,348 centimorgans. With that information, I have a hypothesis that this DNA match may be a half-sibling. And my strategy is to research the DNA match's family tree and social media footprints and try to identify a male family member who could have been in the right place at the right time to be Sue's father. Here's another question that I saw posted on a Facebook group recently. Why would someone I matched with just disappear? How can we make this a better question? One way is to understand why a DNA match that was listed on my DNA match list at Ancestry on August 31st, 2020, no longer appearing on the list. See how that's more specific? It provides a time frame and an occurrence that would help someone trying to answer the question understand what you're looking for and when that information was found. Again, the known facts would be the name of the match, the amount of shared DNA you had with that person, and possibly a screenshot or a download of the match information. Now we can develop a hypothesis. Maybe something has changed with the match. Matches can make themselves private and will no longer appear on your list. Or maybe something changed with your account. And you need to go back and look at what changes you may have made in your account at the Ancestry site. Or there may have been a change in the Ancestry service. In this case, Ancestry deleted many matches just this past weekend that only shared 6 or 7 centimorgans with you. And you'll have seen a drop in the number of Ancestry matches, and they will have disappeared from your match list. They're still out there on Ancestry as a DNA tester. They're just no longer showing up on your list. As you can see, being specific about my question allowed me to come up with strategies where I could search forums for answers to changes that happened at Ancestry, or I could review any changes I made to my Ancestry account that could have caused the problem, or I can understand changes that a match could make to their account that would make them disappear from my list. In this example, we see another lack of specificity. How do we define far back? Are we talking decades, centuries, eons? How far back can I go before DNA is no longer reliable? Which DNA are we talking about? Y DNA, mitochondrial DNA, or autosomal DNA? Well, let's be a little more specific and say, I want to use autosomal DNA to gather evidence of my relationship to my great-great-grandfather. Now that I've provided that specific information, I can look for known facts about that relationship. Using the shared centimorgan chart or the interactive tool at DNA Painter of the shared centimorgan chart, I can see that statistically, I share 6.25% of my autosomal DNA with a great-great-grandfather. My hypothesis then is that I can use autosomal DNA testing to verify my and other relationships in my family to my great-great-grandfather. And my strategy will be to do autosomal testing with my known relatives to that great-great-grandfather. So what have we learned about asking DNA questions? Well, there's basic things about asking any question. Be sure when you approach someone that you introduce yourself. Speak slowly and clearly. There's often a lot of noise going on, especially in an elevator. Keep it specific and keep it short. Remember to pause and allow for a response from the person you're asking the question of. Listen to their answer and repeat what you heard to show that you understood. And don't forget to thank them for their help. What have we learned about the question? Well, we want to be sure that we've clarified our objective. We may want to verify a relationship. We may want to prove a hypothesis. We may want help in clarifying our next steps in our research strategy. What do we want to present in a DNA question about the known facts? Well, make sure that you share the type of test that a person took and at which testing company that test was conducted. Tell how much DNA is shared with the subject of the question. Explain what ethnicity results were received. And provide information on the potential relationships that would be valid based on the known information that you've collected. Be sure to also include any exceptions or unusual circumstances. For example, that there's endogamy in the family that would complicate DNA interpretation. In forming your hypothesis, evaluate your initial information. Don't create a swag or wild guess. Look at the shared DNA, become familiar with the possible DNA relationships, and how that is supported by the paper trail evidence. Identify possible or probable conclusions and think about how you might prove or disprove those conclusions. Be sure and eliminate assumptions. Don't think just, for example, because a man and a woman had a child that they were married. There's a lot of assumptions that we come into DNA research with that have to be questioned when you want to focus on just the genetic relationship. Lastly, we want to say, what have we learned about our research strategy? Well, you develop a research plan and you put it all together, do background research, evaluate your sources, create a search strategy, find those sources, and round and round. With DNA, you want to decide what to test: Y DNA, mitochondrial DNA, autosomal DNA, all three; where to test, which different DNA companies, and what the differences in those companies are that will contribute to answering your question. You'll want to decide who to test and what to do with the results. Lastly, you'll want to identify other evidence that's required, because DNA alone does not answer any genealogical question. There's a lot of opportunities for asking DNA questions, even in today's environment. The chat rooms of virtual webinars and presentations like this one often allow you to submit questions beforehand or afterwards to the speaker, or you can have a chat room during the presentation. Facebook is a great place to find genealogy groups sharing and asking questions about DNA. I particularly like Genetic Genealogy Tips and Tools group on Facebook. Your local genealogical society can also be a good resource for having your genealogical DNA questions answered. My local one here in Youngtown, Arizona, is offering research slots where people can call up and have genealogical questions answered for a small fee. Another good source of information when you're looking for opportunities to asking questions is conferences and meetings. The website conferencekeeper.org gives you a list of upcoming meetings, both virtual and in person, and you can make plans to take your list of questions with your specific information, your known facts, and your research strategies to the conference so that when you have the opportunity, you'll be prepared to ask your question. Importantly, never let your friends feel lonely. Disturb them all the time. What I want to point out here, it's important to not overlook working with others to improve your questions. Practice with your friends and solicit their feedback on how to make your questions more concise, specific, and clear. Collaborate with them on writing out your DNA questions and suggesting improvements to one another. The handout for this meeting includes a form for submitting well-constructed questions to my email address, bonnie.belza@gmail.com. The handout also lists the references that I've made in this presentation. The Everton's Genealogical Helper, again available at myheritage.com. The Board for Certification of Genealogists website, and the article 10-Minute Methodology, How to Ask a Good Research Question. With that, I'll turn it back over to you, Brian.
All right. Thank you, Bonnie. And if there are any questions from the audience, please post them in the chat box and Bonnie can answer them for us. It looks like we do have one question from Steve. It says, my ancestry is 100% Eastern European Jewish, and am wondering how endogamy affects my DNA searches. Ancestry.com says that I have over 24,000 close DNA matches, fourth cousins or closer, and over 120,000 distant matches. My paternal grandparents are also first cousins.
That's a very nice, specific question. Thank you. One of the issues, again, with Jewish Eastern European heritage is the fact that because that was a intermarried culture, there is a lot of endogamy. You will be showing people more closely related to you than they actually are, because you'll share DNA with them from both sides of your family because of the intermarriage in the past. So the endogamy information that you shared with us points me to directing you to a website by a lady named, excuse me here, I'm losing my headset. It points me to a lady named Laura Diamond, L-A-R-A-D-I-A-M-O-N-D, Laura Diamond. She has a website called Genealogy, and she has a lot of very good information on how to research your Jewish heritage. Another person is Roberta Estes, who's a blogger, and Kitty Cooper, another blogger. When you go to a blogger's website, you can search for a specific topic and see their post on how they recommend doing research in a particular area. And both of those ladies have good information on doing Jewish research.
Great, thanks, Bonnie. And it looks like, would you mind putting up the screen again with your email and the DNA Facebook site again?
Sure, Let me do that.
That will answer a couple of the audience's questions.
All right, can you see that then? That's the one with the references, but I think the one that they want is that one with my email address. Can you see that?
Yep, I see it.
All right.
So maybe I'll put it in the chat box as well.
All right. I saw a question too about the website on Facebook. The particular Facebook, it's called a group, and it is a private group. You have to ask to join it, and they usually turn that join request around within a couple hours, if not, and a worst case, in a day's time. The site is called Genealogy Tips, TIPS, and Techniques, and the end is an ampersand. Blaine Bettinger is the founder of that particular group, and he has many admins that are also highly experienced. Over, I think, 10 to 15,000 people participate in it, and you can search that particular group once you join it for some of those educational or technical DNA questions that you might have. Are there any other questions?
It looks like there aren't any right now. Someone
All right.
asked if there was a handout, so I posted a link to the handout in the chat box. And I will also post a link to the handout on the YouTube video as well as on our website when I post this video. And Steve has another question. It says, the bloggers that you mentioned are Roberta Estes and Kitty Cooper?
Yes, Roberta Estes' site is called DNA Explained, all one word, .com. And Kitty Cooper uses her name. It's kittycooper.com.
And also Karen asks, can we email you with our question?
I'll take one question per listener. Sure thing. That will give me feedback on whether this was really useful to you based on the types of questions I get. So I would welcome that. Thank you.
Awesome. And we'll give about 5 more seconds for any last questions for Bonnie. Okay. If that is all, thanks so much for presenting for us, Bonnie. Let me just share the other screen again. And just a reminder about our webinar next week, same time, Wednesday, 5:30 p.m., Mysteries of the Changelog Revealed with Catherine Grant. So be sure to join us for that one, and we hope you all have a great day.